"This is what your grandpa left you, pathetic," my mother sneered, striking the match with a flick so casual it felt rehearsed. My father watched with quiet satisfaction as the flames licked the edges of the $6 million check, the one with my name on it. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I smiled. Because unlike them, I knew something they didn't. And that little fire they were so proud of, it only destroyed paper, not legacy, not love, not the secret my grandfather shared with me alone days before he died. And what they burned that day, it wasn't the inheritance. It was their last chance to ever understand him. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, hit that like button, share your story in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more real healing stories like this. My name is Daisy, and I grew up on a dusty patch of Texas land that smelled of hay oil and secrets. My grandfather, Henry Callahan, was a quiet giant, a cattleman with a spine of steel and a heart like worn leather, rough on the outside but impossibly tender underneath. He built his fortune through decades of backbreaking work, but you'd never know it from the way he dressed: flannel shirts, worn boots, and a straw hat that hadn't changed since 1978. My parents, on the other hand, lived for appearances. Dad chased investments that sparkled on paper but crumbled in wind. Mom wore resentment like perfume. Neither of them respected Grandpa's way of life or mine, because I chose to stay close, because I found beauty in quiet mornings, in honest work in the land itself. When Grandpa passed, I knew the reading of his will would stir trouble, but I didn't expect fire, literal or metaphorical. I didn't expect them to burn my name out of existence. But they forgot something critical. My grandfather never put his faith in banks. He put it in people. And what he gave me, they could never erase. What exactly did Grandpa leave behind, and why did he hide it from the rest of the family? Let's step back in time to uncover the buried truths. Growing up on the Callahan Ranch felt like living between two worlds, one full of love, the other dripping with quiet contempt. On one hand, there was Grandpa Henry. He taught me how to listen to the wind before the rain came, how to mend fences, not just with wire, but with words. He called the soil our oldest friend and said that if you respected the land, it would never betray you. On the other hand, there were them, my parents. To them, the ranch was an embarrassment, a relic that should have been sold decades ago. They wanted a glass house in Austin, not a farmhouse with creaky floors and wild dogs. They laughed when I chose to stay behind after high school, working on the ranch instead of chasing a business degree. "You're wasting your life," my mother once snapped as I fixed a busted water line at 6 a.m. Her heels sank in the mud as she stood watching arms crossed makeup too perfect for the place she hated. "You're not going to inherit anything but dirt and calluses." I remember looking up from that trench and thinking, and still I feel richer than you. My father barely acknowledged me most days unless it was to make some passive remark about playing farmer. To them, I was the stubborn daughter who lacked ambition, who didn't fit the family brand. They kept trying to mold me into something I wasn't: a glossy, polite daughter who married well-networked better and spoke only when spoken to. But Grandpa saw me, really saw me. He'd sit with me on the porch, drinking coffee that tasted like ash, and telling me stories of how he started with nothing but a half-dead mule and a piece of land no bank would touch. He built everything with his hands, his back, and his gut instincts. And he believed I had the same fire. He never said it outright. Grandpa wasn't like that. But in his quiet way, he told me I mattered. When I was 16, they took my little brother Mason to Europe for the summer, a cultural experience, they called it. I wasn't invited. When I asked why, Dad said coldly, "Someone needs to feed the horses." "You're good at that." They returned with diamonds, memories, and photos I was deliberately left out of. That summer, I learned to never expect inclusion, only usefulness. Then came the accident. Grandpa fell from a hayloft during a storm. He broke 2 ribs in his collarbone. Mom and Dad didn't even show up until 3 days later, too busy with a conference in Dallas. I stayed by his bedside for weeks, changing his bandages, spoon-feeding him stew, reading him the papers. When he could talk again, he looked at me and whispered, "They'll never understand what matters, but you do." I cried that night. I cried not because I was sad, but because I felt seen. When Grandpa passed, I wasn't surprised he left the bulk of his estate to charity. But he left the ranch to me and apparently a check for $6 million handwritten and sealed in an envelope addressed to my Daisy. I never got to open it. At the will reading, Mom tore the envelope out of the lawyer's hand, laughed, and tossed it into the fireplace, right there in the sitting room. You? 6 million? He must have been senile. The flames danced in her eyes as if she enjoyed the cruelty, but I didn't react, because I already had something they didn't know about, something Grandpa whispered to me on his last lucid day. If anything happens, go to the northern fence line. You'll find it under the old oak. And read my letter, not a word of it goes to them. That night, I went to the oak tree. My hands trembled as I dug beneath the roots. Wrapped in oilskin and tucked into a metal tin was a folded letter and a set of old keys. The letter began, "Dear Daisy, if you're reading this, they've burned the check. I knew they would. But what they didn't know is that the real legacy isn't in that envelope. It's in the land you're standing on." He explained how 20 years ago, he quietly bought an adjoining property with a freshwater spring and untouched mineral rights. He never told anyone, not even the lawyer, because he didn't trust anyone but me to keep it safe. The land is now yours. I've signed the deed to your name. It's worth more than the check and more than they'll ever know how to handle. But use it wisely. Build something with it. Something good. Something lasting. That letter became my compass. I wasn't just the muddy ranch girl anymore. I was the keeper of a legacy they never bothered to understand. And now I had a choice to make. But how do you build a future when your family wants to tear you down? In the next chapter, you'll see how I turned loss into power and silence into thunder. The morning after I read Grandpa's letter, I stood under that ancient oak with the deed clutched in my hand and the sunrise behind me. The air smelled of dew and mesquite, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I felt chosen. That hidden property just north of the main ranch was breathtaking. Rolling hills, thick grass, natural water sources. Grandpa was right, it was untouched sacred. And the moment I stepped onto it, I knew it was mine in more ways than legal. It was time to rebuild not just the land, but myself. I cashed in my tiny savings, refinanced a pickup, and hired a local contractor who respected Grandpa to help me build a sustainable cattle program, but with a twist. I was going organic. No shortcuts, no chemicals, no investor nonsense. The local ranchers laughed at first. "Callahan's girl thinks she's Joanna Gaines. You need more than heart to survive cattle prices, sweetheart." But I worked day and night. Branding, fencing, mucking out stalls. And people noticed, especially older folks who remembered Grandpa's ethics and grit. They started stopping by, offering advice, lending tools, leaving casseroles on my porch. And then came the first sale, a small herd, pasture-raised, sold to a specialty grocer in Austin. The buyer, a woman who'd once dismissed me at a dinner party for smelling like hay. She wrote a check for $28,000. I stared at the ink drying, heart pounding. That wasn't just money. It was proof. Just a month after that sale, I got a call. It was from my mother. I almost didn't answer. "Daisy, we need to talk." Those 5 words, not demanding, not cruel, were so out of character, they made me sit down. They had lost everything. A bad investment with a tech startup in California. Lawsuits, IRS audits. Their assets, frozen, their accounts under investigation. And then she said it. "The main ranch is going up for auction next quarter." "We didn't know Grandpa took it out of the trust before he died." I did know. He had mentioned it once. "I'm putting it back in my name, just in case. Your parents think everything's automatic, but land is earned, not inherited." Now they were desperate, and they had nowhere else to turn. We were wondering. Mom said over tea, on my porch tea, she didn't even know how to brew herself if you'd consider buying the ranch. "Just until we can stabilize." I looked at her, truly looked at her. For once she wasn't wearing makeup. Her nails were chipped. Her voice had lost its edge. I could have laughed. I could have shouted, You burned my name in a fire, and now you want me to save yours? But instead, I calmly said, I'll buy it, but not for you. I called the auction house, signed the paperwork, and wired the funds not from Grandpa's money, but from my earnings cattle hay and a land management grant I'd quietly won from the state. When the papers were finalized, the ranch, the one they mocked, neglected, and tried to erase, belonged to me. One evening, just before dusk, I heard tires crunching gravel. It was my brother Mason. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Last I heard, he was in finance, trying to outrun the family's collapse. He got out of his car slowly, holding something wrapped in cloth. When he opened it, I saw it was Grandpa's old branding iron. I found this in Dad's garage, he said. Figured it belonged with someone who actually earned it. I didn't speak. My throat tightened. Then he said something that stunned me. You were always the one he trusted. We were just too busy pretending we were better than him to see it. I'm sorry. A few weeks later, a small piece ran in the Texas Cattleman's Journal. Headline: Legacy Ranch Revived by Young Female Rancher. It featured a photo of me in boots and denim, my hands dirty, my smile real. Underneath it, a quote from me: I didn't inherit land. I inherited a purpose. That quote went viral in niche circles. Suddenly, local press called. A podcast featured my story. Schools invited me to speak to their agriculture students. They wanted to hear how I went from farm girl nobody to Callahan Ranch rebuilder. One afternoon, I walked past the old sitting room fireplace, the one where they burned the $6 million check. I stood in front of it holding a frame. Inside was a copy of Grandpa's letter and a photo of him in his straw hat squinting against the sun. Next to it, the deed to the hidden land. I hung it on the wall, not out of pride, but as a reminder, legacy isn't what's left behind. It's what you choose to carry forward. But the story isn't over. When an outsider comes to buy up her land, offering more money than she's ever seen, Daisy will face a decision that tests everything she's fought for: loyalty or escape. I thought the fire was over. The check had burned, but I'd risen from its ashes. I owned the ranch. The community respected me. Even my brother had begun showing signs of redemption. But life, like drought, doesn't send warnings before it cracks the ground beneath your feet. It began with a letter, thick envelope, gold seal. Corporate logo I didn't recognize. I opened it at the kitchen table, still wearing my work gloves and covered in hay. Dear Ms. Callahan, we are writing on behalf of Ruthridge Energy to express our formal interest in acquiring a portion of the Callahan Ranch property. I stopped reading. Ruthridge. I'd heard of them. Land development, oil exploration, commercial expansion. They were infamous for swallowing up family ranches across Texas, draining the land dry and leaving scars in the soil that no rain could heal. Attached was a proposal 10 pages long, outlining their offer $12.7 million for the Northern Ridge, the exact parcel Grandpa had secretly left me. My stomach turned. That land had a spring, wildlife, native grasses untouched by chemicals. It was where he used to walk at sunrise and say, "This here Daisy girl, this is where the land breathes." I folded the letter and walked it straight to the fire pit outside. I didn't burn it, not yet. But I needed it far from the kitchen, far from me. 2 days later, I walked into town for feed and supplies. As I pulled into the co-op lot, I saw her. My mother, standing beside a black Mercedes, talking to a man in a crisp suit. The Ruthridge logo gleamed on his briefcase. I stopped cold, watched from behind the windshield. She was laughing, not like someone begging for help, but like someone sealing a deal. A powerful deal. When she saw me, her face didn't even flicker. She raised a hand in a lazy wave, then went back to talking. That night I drove to their rental condo in town. I didn't knock. I walked straight in. "You sold them information," I said, barely able to breathe. She didn't deny it. "Oh, Daisy, don't be so dramatic. I just gave them context. It's business. They made a very generous offer, and I thought you'd be smart enough to take it." "You had no right." Her voice rose sharp and brittle. "Don't talk to me about rights. You wouldn't have that land without us." Without me, who do you think paid for your clothes, your education, your food? I laughed bitter. You mean the years you spent pretending I didn't exist unless I was useful? Dad walked in then. He looked older, smaller. He said nothing, just stood there. Mom's voice softened like she thought she could still win me. This isn't about greed, Daisy. It's about survival. We could split the money. You wouldn't have to work yourself to death anymore. Just think of it, no more mud, no more fixing fences, no more chores. She looked around the room like it offended her. You could finally be free. I stared at her. Free, I whispered. You burned freedom in that fireplace the day you destroyed Grandpa's check. I went home and sat on the porch until well past midnight. The crickets chirped, the stars stretched forever. The air smelled like cedar and old memories. But inside I was trembling. Not from fear, but from fury. How dare they? How dare they try to erase everything Grandpa built just to clean up their own mess? And yet, 12.7 million. That kind of money could change everything. Fix fences, upgrade equipment, start programs for young ranchers, even buy back land lost decades ago. But at what cost? The land would be stripped, drilled, fenced off. The animals would disappear, the spring would dry, and all that would remain was profit for people who never loved the soil. Grandpa would never forgive me. A week passed. I didn't respond to Ruthridge, but they escalated. Sent another letter, this one more aggressive. It mentioned rights of access and hinted at eminent domain. And then, the final blow. I woke one morning to tire tracks near the ridge, deep, angry ruts slicing through the wet grass. Someone had trespassed. My wildlife camera, normally aimed at the spring, had been moved. I checked the SD card. There they were. 2 Rutheridge men, one holding a GPS scanner, the other snapping photos. I clenched my fists so tight my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just a deal anymore. It was a war. They were going to take what Grandpa left me, what I had fought to preserve, and twist it into something soulless. That night I opened Grandpa's old chest. Inside was the original deed, a few keepsakes, and a letter I hadn't noticed before. It was dated 2 weeks before his death. Daisy, if the day comes when they try to take what they don't understand, remember the land is only yours if you fight for it. They'll come in suits and smiles, but they don't own your backbone. If you need strength, it's already in you. It always was. And I folded the letter, placed it in my jacket pocket, and stood tall. I wasn't just going to protect the ranch, I was going to defend it. But before Daisy can fight, she must choose face the legal firestorm alone, or trust someone unexpected with her grandfather's legacy. The next chapter reveals who shows up when she needs it most, and who disappears when it matters. I spent the next few days in a strange kind of stillness. Not the peace I'd fought for, but the quiet that comes before a storm. I kept doing chores, feeding the horses, repairing the windmill clearing brush. But my mind wasn't there. It was in the letter Grandpa left. It was in the offer. It was in the questions. Was I really strong enough to stand alone? Could I hold back $1 billion company with nothing but barbed wire local law and moral conviction at night? I sat under the stars and traced the ridgeline with my eyes. Every inch of that land was a memory. Grandpa teaching me to ride, helping him plant wildflowers along the fence, running barefoot through the creek with my dog Lucky, and I realized this was more than land. It was the only place I'd ever felt truly seen. He pulled up one morning in his old Ford, dusty and coughing smoke. His hair was longer, his eyes tired, but his voice was steady. You look like you haven't slept in a week. Try dealing with lawsuits, trespassers, and betrayal from your own blood, I said. He leaned against the fence and handed me a paper bag, inside a breakfast burrito and a note. The burrito was warm. The note read, "Let me help M." "I'm not asking you to fix this," I told him. "I'm not even sure you want the same things." "I'm not here for the land," he replied. "I'm here because this is the only real thing we've got left." I stared at him, searching for a catch, but he looked steady, Humble. Not the Wall Street hotshot he'd tried to be. Just a man who'd been humbled by life and remembered who he was. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Not his, a local lawyer's, one who specialized in land rights and environmental defense. "I already set an appointment," he said. "You don't have to do this alone." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept. The next morning, I didn't just go about my routine, I moved with purpose. I called the lawyer, reviewed every inch of the deed. I visited the county clerk's office and filed a formal notice of interest on the ridge blocking any covert acquisitions. Then I printed Grandpa's last letter and framed it over my desk. But the moment that sealed it didn't come from a document or decision. It came from a stranger. A teenage girl showed up on my property, said she was from the local FFA chapter Future Farmers of America. She'd heard my story on a podcast, asked if I'd mentor her project on rotational grazing. She looked at me the way I used to look at Grandpa, like I knew something no textbook could teach. And that's when it hit me. This fight wasn't just for the past. It was for the future. That evening, I drafted an official letter. To Rutheridge Energy, thank you for your interest in Callahan Ranch. However, I will not be selling the ridge or any part of this land. I understand what you're offering, and I choose something different: stewardship over greed. This ranch was built on sweat, soul, and sacrifice. I will not be the one to let it die in silence. Respectfully, Daisy Callahan. I signed it in pen, mailed it by hand. Then I walked to the ridge boots covered in red clay wind, catching the edge of my flannel, and placed a new sign in the soil: Callahan Ridge Protected Land. Trespassers will be prosecuted. But beneath that, in smaller letters, was the real message: this land breathes. Respect it or leave. As the sun set, I stood next to Mason on the ridge line. The grass swayed like it was nodding in agreement. The wind carried the scent of cedar and strength. No matter what they throw at me next, I said, I know what I'm fighting for. He nodded. Then let's give them hell politely. I smiled. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. But not all battles are legal. In Part 6, Rutheridge makes a dangerous move that threatens everything Daisy rebuilt, and she must act fast before the ranch is lost forever. It didn't take long for Rutheridge to respond. They came hard legal threats, media spin, even private investigators snooping around my property lines. But I was ready. Thanks to Mason's connection, my attorney filed a restraining order against further entry onto the ridge. We also submitted environmental documentation proving the area supported a critical water source and native habitats enough to slow any attempt at forced development for years, if not shut it down completely. Then came the public hearing. The town hall was packed. Folks from neighboring ranches, students I'd mentored, even a few old-timers who used to shake their heads at that little Callahan girl with her boots too big. I stood before the microphone holding nothing but a worn photograph of Grandpa beside the ridge, smiling, covered in dust and proud. I told the story of the check they burned, of the legacy they tried to erase, of the land that wasn't just dirt but memory. When I finished, the room was silent. Then someone stood and clapped. Then another and another. The board denied Rutheridge's application for zoning expansion, unanimously, my mother and father. The ones who had laughed as they torched Grandpa's gift were there sitting stiff in the back. When the verdict was read, they didn't look at me, didn't speak, just stood and left like ghosts, their silence. That was the closure I never knew I needed. Back on the ranch, I planted a wildflower bed on the ridge in Grandpa's honor. I didn't need a statue. The land was the monument. In the final chapter, Daisy reflects on how healing doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like planting roots where others only saw profit. The fight was over. But the real victory wasn't in court filings or board decisions. It was in the quiet, the kind that settles deep in your bones when you know finally you stood your ground. I walk the ridge every morning now, sometimes with Mason, sometimes with a student, sometimes alone. The land is still rough, still wild, but it's alive, just like Grandpa wanted. The pain from my parents, the betrayal, the years of feeling invisible. They don't haunt me anymore. They taught me where not to give my worth. Because the truth is, what they burned was never mine to begin with. What was mine dignity? Legacy love they couldn't touch. So if someone ever tells you you're not enough, that your values are outdated, that you should stay small while they cash in, look them in the eye, and build something they can't destroy. If Daisy's story moved you, leave a comment, share your thoughts, or tell us your own story of choosing peace over profit. We're listening.